Hey, now it's the Rob from 106.1 KISS FM here with my 16-bit colleague.
Hey guys, Steve, web contributor to 1061evansville.com.
That's right, and we've got a great topic for you today on the 16-bit superstars. We love old games, especially Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. Now, yes. Steve, I believe you said before you agree with me on this, but the public perception, I feel like, is that Super Nintendo won the war over Sega Genesis in the 90s console wars. Yeah. However, there were a lot of games that were released on both consoles. Mm-hmm. Now, normally, under normal circumstances, I would say that the Super Nintendo version was always just a little bit better, even if it was the exact same game.
Agreed.
But there are a few exceptions to that rule, and we've put together a list of a few games that we feel are better on the Sega Genesis that were also on Super Nintendo. So here we're going to go. We're going to get things started. I have like an honorable mention. I've got a few games here that I think are worth talking about. We'll mention this one first. Jurassic Park was a game that was released both on Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, but the Genesis one was way cooler. It had more violent dinosaurs that would eat you, and the game was actually in a lot of ways very different than its Super Nintendo platforming cohort. So I want to say that for an honorable mention, good old Jurassic Park. The biggest movie from my childhood, literally. Yeah. From a financial standpoint, no movie was more successful than Jurassic Park. All right, Steve, you want to kick things off for your top three? What's one game that was better on Sega Genesis?
Okay, when you brought this to my attention, the one game came out above all others, and I'm like, okay, I have to say this. And it's probably the most recognized game, Mortal Kombat.
Mortal Kombat is on my list as well, so let's talk about it. My list is really in no particular order. Yeah. I feel like this should be the number one. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah. On the NES, they didn't offer as much violence. It almost like it was geared, as much as it could be, more geared towards kids.
Okay, that's right. Now, if you remember, on the Super Nintendo, the blood was gray-toned, intended to be sweat.
Yes.
On the Sega Genesis, you had real blood, and you had real violence, and not only that, you probably had the most violent game you could play on a home console at the time.
Yes.
The 3-button configuration, I feel like, hurt the Sega Genesis in future installments of that game. And if you remember, by the time Mortal Kombat 2 hit the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, it was a bloodfest on both systems. So they corrected that. But not only was the blood missing, things like ripping out someone's heart as Kano in a fatality. Yes. The heart was just absent. Yeah. Where in the Sega Genesis, he held it up and it was still a beating heart in his hand. Or when you're biting someone's head off or whatever, it's not the same with sweat.
Yeah.
So I say that is the best choice for the game that was better on Sega Genesis than it was on Super Nintendo. Yes. I'm going to give you another one that I also feel is obvious. NBA Jam was released to arcade consoles, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, and I don't know anyone who played this on Super Nintendo. Everyone...
I did.
Did you really?
I did.
Everyone I know played this one on Sega Genesis because it sounded a little bit better, it looked a little bit better, the controller was a bit more adept for it because you didn't need a whole lot of buttons for NBA Jam. Something about the game just played better on the Sega Genesis, in my opinion. Your thoughts? Now, it seems like you're Super Nintendo on this one.
Yeah, I'm pretty much a Super Nintendo guy across the board.
Me too.
I honestly never played NBA Jam on the Sega Genesis, so I don't have anything to rebut your case. But I enjoyed NBA Jam. Okay. And I can see where the button configuration would come into play there.
Yeah, it was having them all lined out because you only needed the 3 buttons. You had shoot, pass, and turbo. Yeah. So that was helpful to me. All right, you want to go with one?
Yeah, staying in the sports realm, Madden. 1994, 1995 was notorious for glitches on the NES. I believe one of the 2 years they even had where rosters were mixed up, and they never did anything to correct that for those games.
Right. I would say almost across the board, EA Sports excelled on Sega Genesis. Yeah. Whether you're talking about Madden, whether you're talking about NHL, there were so many, the NCAA franchises, almost all sports games in general excelled on Sega Genesis, although I was not a big sports games fan. Yeah. Gonna give, let's see, I got a few more here to talk about. Actually, I guess I only have one more here to talk about. The next game I want to talk about is going to sound stupid because this is not as epic of games as we've been talking about. But there was a game called Beavis and Butthead that was released both on Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. However, they were not just ports. They were very different games built from the ground up very differently. The Sega Genesis version really kicked the Super Nintendo version's butt. The levels, the backgrounds, the sound effects, the things they would say, the farting, the burping, all of it sounded and looked better on the Sega Genesis. So that is my last induction. Beavis and Butthead, you were a Sega Genesis troop, in my opinion. And what, do you have one more?
Yeah, one more. It's not as notable as Mortal Kombat, but the landscape between the Super NES and Sega Genesis was probably the widest, in my opinion. That's Earthworm Jim.
I brought that one. I almost mentioned that. Here, as a visual aid. Good old Earthworm Jim.
I actually played that on both systems. The NES was fun, entertaining. When you got to the Sega Genesis, it seemed the most like a cartoon, like you were actually playing a cartoon character. Very fluid in the graphics and the sound. And that's what I probably noticed the most. I know Mortal Kombat's more well known, but Earthworm Jim was just on the Sega Genesis, just far beyond the NES.
I don't know that I played it on both consoles, but I think that the public perception about that one's probably right. Yeah. If you were to ask kids in 1996 or whenever the game came out, which version's better, I think Sega Genesis would have probably won that one. So I think that's a great choice. Yeah. And good stuff. You know what we should talk about sometime in the future, maybe even next week or over the next 2 weeks, talk about the exclusive games and which ones, what were the most important Super Nintendo exclusive games.
Okay.
Sega Genesis,
Good.
So we can talk about that here soon. We appreciate you tuning in to the 16-Bit Superstars. We're going to be back with another episode every Wednesday. You can subscribe to get these videos before anybody else does, or, of course, you can email us if you want to, Rob at 1061 Evansville, and Steve, yours is...
Mine's actually everlast311@att.net.
So check that out. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to our channel, and we'll be back next week.
Thanks, guys.